So first of all, I'm wondering if you can just summarize briefly the events of 2008 that led to you being charged with the two felonies for disrupting the auction.
Well, the BLM was holding an oil and gas auction at the very end of the Bush administration that they were trying to get as much land into the hands of the oil companies as possible. And they weren't doing their due diligence. They weren't following their own standards. And they were auctioning off parcels of land right outside of Arches and Canyonlands National Park. And so I went there to do whatever I could to delay that auction long enough that a new administration could come in and hopefully decide to start following the laws that were already in place. Not knowing what that might look like, I walked in and someone asked me if I wanted to be a bidder. And so I said yes, and ended up getting signed up to be a bidder and went inside and then saw an opportunity to really have a major impact. And after a little bit of weighing the consequences, I decided that I had to jump in and stand in the way of this fraudulent auction that was going on. And so I started driving up the prices initially, and then finally started winning parcels and started winning every single parcel until they finally stopped the auction and took me out.
And what were you thinking when you were bidding? I mean, were you surprised that you were winning? I mean, what were your thoughts as it was going, that this was spiraling more than you had anticipated, or?
My thoughts were, this is the most effective thing I've ever done with my life. I saw that I was having a significant impact, and saw that it had the potential to bring a lot of attention to what was going on. And it was successful at doing that, and they ended up overturning the auction then later on.
And at the time when that was still in process and you were winning, were you worried about consequences?
Yeah. I mean, going into it, I figured that I would probably be going to prison for doing this. But, I'd been concerned about my future for a long time, and I knew that a few years in prison was far less scary than staying on the path that we're on now.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the confrontation that happened with, at the actual auction when you were approached?
Well, they just took a break in the auction, and an agent came over and showed me a badge and said, "Can we go talk outside?" And he basically just asked me what I was doing there, and if I could pay for these parcels. And I said, "Well, I can't pay for these parcels, and I'm here to stand in the way of this auction because it's a threat to my future and a fraud against the American people." And so at that point, they took me into custody and ended up questioning me for several more hours. And it was a very laid-back, kind of friendly conversation where they were really trying to figure out what I was doing there and why. And so they were asking a lot of questions about my motivations and how I'd gotten to this point of feeling like this level of action was necessary. And so I was telling them a lot about my background, my views on the climate crisis, and my views on the failure of our government to really do anything about it.
And so you were in fact charged with two felonies.
Yes.
Correct. And what were those charges?
The first was violating the Oil and Gas Leasing Act, and the second was making false statements.
And it's been almost 3 years. Your trial just concluded.
Right.
You could have, probably at several points throughout the whole ordeal, entered a plea bargain. Why
Yes.
didn't you?
Several reasons. One that I think the jury is a really important part of our legal system. And as an activist, my goal is not to settle things down. My goal is to stir things up. And that opportunity to escalate things into a jury trial, I think, is an important part of civil disobedience. And I think that jury trial used to be an important part of our legal process. Now it's kind of been minimized, but part of the way that it's been minimized is that people have been intimidated out of taking their cases to a jury. And it's generally just taken as conventional wisdom that if you take your case to a jury, you'll be punished for it and get a stronger sentence, which means that it's not really a right anymore. Because if you get punished for exercising a right, then it's not really a right. And I also saw that the government really wanted me to take a plea bargain in this case. And I think that's because they wanted things to settle quietly. And I certainly had a very different goal. I think the government realized that my act, like any act of civil disobedience, is inherently a statement that I don't accept the government's sole authority to be the moral conscience of what constitutes right and wrong. And then I'm going to act out of a higher sense of moral obligation. And I think they saw that as a threat to their power, which civil disobedience usually is. And so I think it's really important for the government in civil disobedience cases to have an activist come before the court and bow their head and say, I'm sorry for what I did, and I throw myself at the mercy of the court, so that they can reestablish that moral authority and show that people are still afraid of their power. And of course, I had the opposite motivation, so I wasn't really interested in a plea bargain.
So you mentioned a higher sense, and there have been reports that you have had the full support of your religious community.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of role, if any, does your spiritual beliefs or background play in both your initial action and in the events following?
My spiritual beliefs play some kind of role, but I think my spiritual community plays a much bigger role. I think the fact that I was connected to that religious community with the First Unitarian Church here in Salt Lake City is part of what empowered me to take that action, knowing that there would be a base of support there, knowing that I wasn't just an isolated individual, but that I was connected to something larger and more powerful than myself. And I think that's part of what's lacking on the left today is that sense of empowerment and that realization that we're connected to something far bigger than ourselves. And that community has certainly come through in more ways than I ever expected going into this. They've been a huge base of support for me throughout this process, and I think have really carried me through it. And I think the only way that my spiritual beliefs really played into this was that acknowledgement that I'm not an isolated individual, that I'm connected to something much greater than ourselves. That the Unitarians call it the interconnected web of life of which we're a part. And I think that realization was able to put the choice of going to prison in proper perspective for me. That facing the climate crisis, it's not about me trying to avoid those consequences, because if I realize that I'm part of an interconnected web of life, then everything that impacts people around the world is impacting me as well. And that you can't really be happy in a world of suffering. And seeing that, the choice then of consequences was, one guy going to prison for a few years versus billions of people suffering for a lifetime. And so that was a pretty easy choice to make with that perspective.
So that connectivity has also kind of opened you up in some ways to a charge that some critics have had, that you were duped into doing this. How do you respond to that?
I haven't heard that charge. I think in the trial, the charge was the exact opposite, that I knew exactly what I was doing.
For people who aren't as familiar with the actual case, if they say, oh, well, he was put up to that, or he must have, somebody put pressure on you to kind of be a patsy for an organization, how do you respond?
I haven't even heard that as a criticism, and I've heard a lot of criticisms over the past 2 years. I don't know who they're suggesting would have put me up to it or what evidence there is for that. I think I would need at least some basis of a charge to know how to respond to it even.
So what about the idea that there were still alternatives other than actually trying to bid on the parcels, that you should have exercised some other kind of alternative? Or was that your only action?
Well, that's something
available?
that's something that the government has tried to proclaim, that there's a process of filing written protests to certain leases in these oil and gas auctions, and that I could have just filed a protest and hoped that worked. But this auction happened 2 months after a congressional report was filed in Washington by the chairman of the House Committee on Public Lands, revealing that the BLM, with those written reports, was taking volunteers from the oil and gas industry to process those written reports. That the oil companies were actually paying people specifically for the purpose of volunteering for the BLM to help process the backlog of protests. So it literally would have been an appeal to the oil companies to please just not destroy our public land, to please do something other than exploit our natural resources for your private property or private profits. And I think it would have been ridiculous to actually have faith in that system. This auction was also a few months after the Department of the Interior scandal, where the oil regulators were caught taking bribes of sex and drugs from the oil companies that they were supposed to be regulating. And actually the Inspector General, the government's own Inspector General, called the Department of the Interior a pervasive culture of ethical failure. So I think it would have been unreasonable to expect that that any of those agencies, any of those legal alternatives would have put the interests of the American people ahead of those of private corporations.
And you were not allowed, actually, by the judge in your case to explain to the jury underlying motivations. Tell us a little bit about that decision, how it affected your defense, and how you felt when that stipulation was revealed to you.
Well, I think when that ruling really happened, that I wasn't able to explain my motivations, I think that's when it became clear exactly what this trial was, that it wasn't an attempt at justice, because justice has nothing to fear from knowledge. Justice doesn't depend on an ignorant jury. And so it made it clear that it was an attempt at intimidation. And during the trial, I was able to squeeze in some of my views when I was on the stand about some of what my mindset was at the time of the auction. But I wasn't able to introduce any supporting evidence for my views. I just had to throw them out there like, oh, I'm just some guy and this is what I think. I wasn't able to let the jury know that the government agreed with me, that they admitted that the auction wasn't legal in the first place. I wasn't able to introduce the massive amount of scientific evidence that shows the threat that's really presented by this drill now, think later mentality. The basic restriction that was put on me in the trial was I could only talk about things that happened on December 19th, 2008. And anything that didn't happen on that day wasn't considered relevant.
So what were you thinking right before the verdict was read? Were you worried? Did you feel confident? Did it surprise you?
I expected the verdict, based on the fact that the jury was denied all that information, that they, had no idea the kind of sentence that they were convicting me for, and just seeing the pressure that was put on them by the judge and the court. I think that the verdict was kind of a foregone conclusion by the time that it happened. I saw that institutional authority that was really bearing down on the jury, saying, you're not to use your conscience in making this decision. It's not your job to decide if this is right or wrong. I mean, actually, in the written instructions from the judge, it said, do not question the wisdom of the law that you're enforcing. And so there was all that authority bearing down on them, drilling that message into their head that they weren't allowed to follow their conscience. And I think that's a pretty horrible position to actually put somebody in. And I actually felt sympathy for the jury, that they felt pressured into making that decision. And they felt that they were in a position where they were forced to do something that they thought was morally wrong. So it was kind of expected that they came to the decision that they did.
So now you face a possible maximum of up to 10 years in prison. Was this worth a decade of your life?
Yes, absolutely. Going into this, I made the decision that it was worth going to prison for the direct impacts of keeping that oil in the ground, of reversing this one auction. And I thought that was worth it, and that's happened. That part has been successful, which I still think makes it worth it. But it's also had far bigger impacts with the indirect impacts of all the people that have been awakened or empowered by seeing this example. I think that was really shown in the street outside of the trial with the people that were out there the entire week refusing to be intimidated by this trial.
Your supporters have called you a hero. Is that a term you're comfortable with?
I think it's only relative to the rest of a movement. I would consider what I did completely rational, or the only rational response to someone in my situation. I think if we're going to have any shot at a livable future, that kind of thing needs to become normal, and not considered heroic, but just considered the responsibilities of a citizen or the responsibilities of an ethical person to stand in the way of the path that we're on.
There was a report that there was a group of school children that came to observe your trial.
Mm-hmm.
What do you hope those kids learned by watching that?
Well, I hope they saw what resistance looks like. That it was people singing out in the street, and that resistance holds that piece of joy and resolve. Fighting back against injustice, that it oftentimes looks like people just holding on to that joy in the face of intimidation. So hopefully the students remember that.
Are you a role model?
Perhaps.
Do you have any other advice that you think you could give or should give to particularly young people?
Well, I think the most important thing about my story was that I did go into it with the intention of being powerful enough to stand in the way of that auction. And I think it was that commitment to being an effective agent of change that really made all of this possible. And I think that's the first and most important step in really being a powerful activist, is making the decision to be. I think if we hold the perspective that we're weak and we're powerless and we're just a victim of our society, then it's gonna be true, and we're not gonna see any opportunities to take action like this. But once we start looking at ourselves as really powerful citizens, really powerful human beings who can shape the course of our world, we start to see the opportunities to make it happen.
So looking towards the future, after you serve your time, whatever that ends up being,
Mm-hmm.
what happens next? What do you see yourself doing for the rest of your
life? I don't know. I've had a hard time for a while, even before this auction, really envisioning how my life might play out. I think there's a huge amount of questions for what the rest of my life will look like, not just for me, but for my whole society. I think that there's so much hanging in the balance right now that it almost feels impossible to plan my future more than a few years out.
How has the whole ordeal changed you?
This has liberated me and empowered me, and I actually feel a lot lighter and happier than I used to. I think that it was really frustrating and nearly traumatizing to be obedient to the unjust society that we have, and have to view myself as this helpless victim. And now, when I've been in complete resistance over the past 2 years, and I've been basically giving all that I have to fighting for a healthy and just world, that's liberating and uplifting. Knowing that I'm no longer complicit with injustice. I think that has really been healing for me in a lot of ways.